Today on The State of Us, a shrinking workforce could mean economic danger for the United States. Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined today by the one and only, your friendly redneck liberal and the senior resident historian here at True Chat, Mr. Lance Jackson. Today, we're looking at the shrinking workforce and its potential to impede the economy's ability to grow and make for a less prosperous future. It sounds bad, but I think if we understand the data behind it, we can also talk about some potential solutions. A big thing that we look at that we hear talked about frequently is the unemployment rate, but we're actually going to talk about the workforce participation rate as well today, and those are not the same thing. So we got a lot to cover, Lance.
It is, and I think what made this article interesting for me when I read it is that it's claiming that COVID just made us recognize a problem that was already existing in our society. And now that COVID is starting to wane, at least I think we all hope so and are planning on it doing that, that we're still going to be faced with this labor shortage for a long time. So that's what's interesting is it's like, oh, well, you know, COVID did this. And once we get out of COVID, everything will be back to normal. And according to the authors of this article, maybe not so fast when it comes to the labor force.
Yeah. So when we think about COVID, obviously, we think about a lot of things, but one of them is the labor shortage, right? The COVID crisis roiled the U.S. job market like nothing before. First, in the early days of the pandemic, millions of people were suddenly without work, sending the unemployment rate from 3.5% in February of 2020 to 14.7% 2 months later. Then the jobs came roaring back, but not all the workers did. A constellation of factors, fears of contracting and spreading COVID, lingering symptoms, the financial wherewithal provided by several rounds of government relief, lost access to childcare, and a shifting of priorities set off by the pandemic conspired to keep people off the job. At the end of November, the Labor Department recorded a seasonally adjusted 10.5 million job openings, or 1.7 unfilled jobs for each person counted as unemployed. That's the highest ratio got in the 20 years of available data before the pandemic was 1.2, and we're at 1.7.
And we've talked about that umpteen times here on this show. That's our word of the day. We'll talk more about it in the next segment. But there are more jobs available in our economy than there are people looking for work. So there's a shortage because of that. You know, I mean, it's like, okay, well, you know, we've got this unemployment rate and we need to get people to work. Well, if everybody who was unemployed as determined by the government took a job that is open, we're not, you know, talking about the fact that they don't fit the skill set that people have, whatever. But even if they did, we're still short people. We're still short workers. I don't know. And it's just, last night, my wife and I were out and we were sitting in the parking lot and it was one of those parking lots where I turned and I could see 5 different business establishments. All 5 had a sign in the window or up on their placard or somewhere that said help wanted. I mean, every store I saw, every business that I could see while I was sitting in my vehicle was looking for people to work. And I looked at my wife and I said, you know, I see this and I look at it, there's an opportunity. I see help wanted. I could go make some money. You know, and as you know, if you're a longtime listener, I'm retired. But I look at that and like, that's an opportunity to make some money. And she said, yeah, but unfortunately, there aren't a lot of people that do that anymore. I don't know if that's true or not, but it was interesting that, you know, that my take on it and her take on it, that, you know, I look at all these help wanted signs and it's like in the moment, I'm like, oh, I'm going to go apply because, hey, even if they're only paying $14 an hour or whatever, that's a chance. Well, I could work there a couple of days a week and pocket some extra money. And her response was, yeah, but there are a lot of people out there today that don't look at it that way. But even if they did, right? Even if we all did, we still don't have enough people to fill all the jobs.
Well, and that's where the unemployment rate, which we've talked about before, is important to understand, right? The unemployment rate is simply determined by dividing the unemployed individuals by the total number of individuals in the labor force. So you might say, well, what are unemployed individuals? Well, in this case, those are people that are unemployed and seeking employment as defined by the government. So one of the things that we've discussed before that's a misnomer is that the unemployment rate doesn't factor in all the people that could work. It simply factors in the people that are looking to work. But how do we get a clear picture? Well, we look at the unemployment rate, right, which is at 3.5% right now. But what about the workforce?
Which is a good rate.
Correct.
Right? I mean, I mean, as far as an unemployment rate, I mean, I remember, again, I remember back when you had to walk uphill both ways to go to school. Yeah, I'm old. But unemployment rate was 7, 8, 9%. And we were talking about recession and we were having all kinds of problems economically. And it's like 3.7. I mean, I hardly ever remember the unemployment rate being under 5%. So that's a good unemployment rate. But yet we're saying one of the reasons for a sluggish economy is we can't fill all the jobs.
Right. Well, and that's where we talk about the U.S. labor force participation rate, because it certainly seems like there's plenty of people that are still waiting on the sidelines. For December, the Labor Department reported that the labor force participation rate, what's that? The share of non-institutionalized population age 16 and up that is either working or looking for work was a seasonally adjusted 62.3%. That's compared with 63.3% in February 2020. If the participation rate was back at the pre-pandemic level, with the unemployment rate remaining at 3.5%, there would be over 2.5 million additional people counted as employed.
And therein is what, to me, what makes this article interesting is, to my wife's point the other night when we were out, people just aren't looking to work. I mean, that's what that says, right? Is that there are 2.5 million more people that should be working if you compare current statistics to historically what happens at this level of unemployment. And not that that would be enough to fill all the jobs, but all the help wanted signs that we're all seeing in these entry-level positions would be gone. And I'm just saying these were entry-level positions. I know that in the news we're seeing, so-and-so big corporation is laying off, this amount of, white-collar workers or whatever. But there are still and if you've been into a store, you're looking around, you're like, is there anybody here who can help me? Or, I went into one store and they said, I'm sorry, we're closing. I said, wait a minute. The sign says you're open till 8. It's only 6 o'clock. Yeah, well, I don't have anybody here to cover the night shift, and I've already been here since 8 in the morning, and I'm the manager. I'm going home.
Look, if the unemployment rate was the same, right, 3.5%, but if the workforce participation rate was higher, we would have more people working. Likewise, you could even have a slightly higher unemployment rate, but if the workforce participation rate was, say, where it was at in 2000, which, by the way, was at 67% versus 62% today, okay, that's 5 percentage points. And you're talking about, another probably 12 to 14 million people working. By current standards today. Well, how would things be different if there were 12 to 14 million more people who were looking for work?
So the problem is the worker shortage is because there's a number of people that aren't even looking for a job.
Yeah. Well, and part of what the article reveals is like, what is to account for that? Is that young people being lazy and not working? Is it that the boomers were this large generation and now they're leaving? Is it, is it something else? What are there just less people? Like what is happening? Is the economy growing faster than we can grow the population? In other words, we've created more jobs. Therefore, it makes the participation, not the participation rate, but our ability to fill the jobs is complicated because, even if the participation rate drops, if we have also added, for example, new jobs in new industries that didn't previously exist, well, now even if the participation rate had stayed the same, we'd still have a shortage because we can't fill the available jobs. And that's a separate measure, right? The unemployment rate's not tied to how many available jobs there are. Neither is the workforce participation rate. That there's always an assumption that those two things, well, we measure these, but the other thing that's very much related to that, I mean, historically, is how many jobs are available, for people to take. And are people not educated for the right job? So what is the primary motivating factor? Well, surprise, it's obviously a combination of these things, but it's not just the obvious one of people don't want to work. It's also that people started leaving the workforce partly because of COVID sooner than they might have. And you say, well, what are we talking about? Well, when we look at the median boomer turning 66 last year, they are now in an age bracket where there is typically a huge drop in participation. But indeed, we've seen a much larger drop in participation. In December, the participation rate among 66-year-olds, unadjusted for seasonal swings, was about 38%. Compare that with 64-year-olds who, despite being just 2 years younger, had about a 46% participation rate. So the other thing to look at is that some people who may have stayed in the workforce longer, and in other countries, Japan is one that they bring up in this article, which I think is a great example. Japan has basically by 10 years, a higher median age than the US, but their workforce participation rate is actually higher. And one of the ways they've accomplished that is by making it easier for older people to work longer. Good, bad, or otherwise, that is an important factor too. So before people just, hate on young people, and it's like, well, young people just don't work, and that's why there's so many jobs available. There's a lot of factors. Is that potentially one contributing factor? Okay, yeah, that could be one contributing factor. People that would have typically stayed on the job another 5 or 10 years, even though they don't have to, they probably would have. A lot of them left and said, I'm not going back, which is okay, but it leads to other things then, that there's only so many other people that can fill the jobs. And to the point that we've talked about before, it's not a 1-for-1. If you had a senior level manager who was 64 who said, hey, I was going to work until I was 70, but you know what? It's just not worth it with everything going on. I'm just done. Well, you're not going to take somebody that's 17 years old and say, oh, well, we're going to hire you for that job. I mean, and that's not a whether or not the 17-year-old wants to. It's just not a practical. It's not an option.
Well, and who are living in the right part of the country where the jobs are available? Because there's also that. There are places that maybe have all the workers they need, because there are plenty of people to choose from. When I was out in Arizona this fall, there weren't a lot of help wanted signs. Why? Because I was in a part of Arizona where the population is booming, and there was, obviously plenty of workers to fill all the jobs. So, it depends too on where you live as to how big the worker shortage is and what types of workers it is that you are looking for.
So we've talked about how old people are to blame, but let's also talk about how young people are to blame, because, it's not all one age group's fault. And to say fault is tricky too, because it's not like when somebody in an older or younger age bracket consciously makes this decision, they're thinking, oh, well, what I want to do is lower the workforce participation rate. Most people, that's not the reason they do it, right? Now that may be an effect, but that's not why they do it. So let's talk about what are we seeing among young people that could also be problematic. Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. In addition to the decline among older people, not just because they're retiring, but also those that have left the labor force sooner than we anticipated them leaving the labor force, there's also been a decline in participation among younger men with less education, a trend even before the pandemic struck. Washington University in St. Louis economist Dane Lee calculated that the largest contributor to the overall drop in participation since the pre-pandemic period has been young men without a 4-year college degree. Economists have been trying to figure out why for a while. One theory, which precedes the pandemic, was that video gaming was cutting into young men's willingness to work. More recent research suggests that status might be a factor, with a widening wage gap between people with and without 4-year college degrees, leading some less educated men to be less willing to join the workforce. Whatever the reason, their absence could pose a protracted problem because people who don't work when they are young often don't work as they become older. That is a challenge not only for the individual, but for society. For the economy, fewer people coming into the workforce would mean that the job market wouldn't be able to grow very quickly without driving the unemployment rate, which is already at an over 50-year low, even lower. That could in turn drive up wages and ultimately inflation. Absent more immigration or an increase in worker productivity, the economy's ability to grow could be limited, making for a less prosperous future. This is when we talk about it being kind of a vicious cycle thing, right? Regardless of the reason, we have an economy that largely relies on growth and that has been growth oriented for basically since the Great Depression, right? I mean, you could argue even before that because it's not like we never grew before that, but our modern industrial complex is heavily based on the notion of business grows so that it makes more money, which means it hires more people. It can pay its existing people better, and those people can have better lives so they can buy more goods so that business can be stimulated so that it can grow, and so on and so forth. And the process keeps going. Of course, the issue with that model is that you have to continue to have enough people to support the growth of the system, because you either have to increase how productive a person is to meet the rising demands of a business, or you have to have more people to do the work.
As I said in the last, I'm going to go back to the young men choosing not to work, whatever the reason may be. And it's the umpteenth time that I get on technology and video games, right? And that's our word of the day. Umpteen is an adjective. UMPTEN, teen. Notice the teen in there. Teenager,
Umpteen.
Young, umpteen. Means very many or indefinitely. For the umpteenth time, there it is in black and white printed. And since you're going to fault the older generation who's actually worked their entire life to decide to quit working as one of the problems, the article points out, for whatever reason, young males are looking not to enter the workforce. There's this, commercial on TV where this young 20-something is embarrassed because his mother is handing out job applications for him everywhere he goes. And the thing of the song, it's a LinkedIn commercial or something, a LinkedIn commercial. And it says, the young man says, well, I need to find a job. And I'm thinking, the first thing I said out of my mouth was, yeah, quit living at home and go get a job. But no, we're not. Cause mommy and daddy are going to take care of me and just let me live at home. And that way I can play my video games and, I don't have to work. And then,
so is this a parenting problem or a child problem?
I'm not sure, but when I talk to 17-year-olds and they say, well, I don't want a job. I just want to get a car and drive around and go get food with my friends and hang out and play video games. It's like, whoever told you that's what life is? My question to you is, where's the disconnect? Because you're not that way. My daughters aren't that way. I'm not patting them on the back, but now they're also college educated. You're not. I mean, you went to college and chose a different life.
I don't have a college degree.
You don't have a college degree, which is what they're talking about there. Yeah. And we've gone around and around on this show about the importance of a college education. And, we've always come down and said, well, there's a lot of jobs out there that you can make a good living. You don't need a college degree. But this article is pointing out that if you're a young male and you don't have a college degree, that might be one of the reasons why you're choosing not to work, because there is such a wage gap between males who have a college education working and males who don't have a college education and what they can make. So you're only going to pay me $15 an hour. I won't even bother to work. I'll just sit in mom's basement and play video games. And I don't mean to be disparaging, but at the same time, there are a lot of people my age who feel that way. Like you're in your mid-20s. Why don't you have a job? Well, I can't find one. Well, there's one right there. You can go flip burgers for $15. Well, I don't want. You know what? I didn't want that job either, but I took that job so that I could get a better job. And there is a disconnect there. Is that because my generation didn't do a very good job at showing people that you can't just get to where I am? You know, as a child, you don't get to have the same things and the same level of wealth as your parents, because your parents have worked for it.
One of the reasons I think they're having a hard time pinning it down is because it varies a lot, and I think it is a culmination of factors. One of them that they touch on, right, which is that this notion of the wage gap between college educated and non-college educated. Part of the issue is that we know that a ton of openings are also in the trades, and the trades have a high demand, and yet we're having trouble filling those. I think part of this is a communication problem as well, of that gap is widening because the jobs that need filled, that are those good paying jobs that don't require a college degree, aren't getting filled. So the jobs that are available are the low paying wage jobs. The jobs that pay as well or better than those with a college degree aren't getting filled. And then the people that are actually making decent money are the ones that are getting the college degree. And the trades are being left kind of in this air gap here. And part of the problem is communication about it, and also ability to enter the trades. We say they're in demand, but one of the things, you know, for example, I was talking to a contractor the other day who by education is an electrical engineer, you know, knows what there is to know about electrical, has been doing electrical work for years, could pass the test today to become, you know, from a knowledge standpoint, could tell you everything you need to know to be an electrician, but can't become a licensed electrician. And the reason is because, you know, depends on who you ask and how they're going to phrase this, but the trade unions responsible for basically regulating the licensing of electricians require that you have a certain number of apprentice hours with an electrician that's already licensed. Now, that sounds really good in theory because, well, sure, we want you to have on-the-job experience. That makes a lot of sense. What if there's nobody that wants to initiate those apprenticeship programs? You might say, well, why is that? Because aren't these in high demand? That's exactly why you wouldn't want to initiate an apprentice program. Because if I'm a licensed electrician,
sure,
Lance,
I get it,
and the books are overflowing, and I have more work than I can meet. If I bring
That's job security,
right? I mean, if I bring in and train 5 guys, and now they're licensed electricians, why would they keep working for me?
Right. Their competition with
why
me.
not go get their own business?
Yep.
So it's not. I'm not saying that electricians are being mean. I'm saying the way we've set up the system right now, there's not a great incentive for people who are licensed. And this is not just electricians. This is plumbers, HVAC, all these different trades, right, that we need more of. There's not a good incentive for people in the field to train people who aren't going to stay at that company and who are going to literally go start a competitive business.
But what about the number of young people who aren't taking an entry-level job and just turning up their nose at it and waiting for that, quote, their perfect job to come around? How do we fix that?
The belief among some is that there's no way they're going to get to the next tier, because as the gap widens for a confluence of reasons, right? I mean, there's a lot of different reasons that the gap widens. We talked about the trade air gap, I think, is part of it, but there's a lot of other things that go into that as well, like the type of jobs in the economy that pay well today versus other jobs. As that gap widens, the people who are at the bottom of the gap look at it and say, yeah, there's no way I'm going to cross that bridge. You know, if the bridge is...
If you don't take the first step, you're not going to.
Right. But if the bridge is 10 feet, it's a lot easier to take the first step because you can see the other side.
But then why do they think that way? Because I started out at the bottom.
The relative from bottom to next step, or from middle to next step, or whatever, those steps were smaller. Doesn't mean they were easy.
But they never
They
crossed
were
my
smaller
mind.
steps.
They never crossed my mind.
And maybe that's because...
And why? And that's my point. Why is that? Why do at 17, 18, 19, 20, 22 years old, you already are looking at it like, I'll never get there? I never thought that. It was like, the only way I'll get anywhere in life is if I get up off my rear end and go get a job somewhere.
No, I mean, I'm giving the data behind it. I think that part of what we have to talk about is what has the data and what they see contributed to an overall mindset. Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. Japan is the epitome of an aging country, with the United Nations projections showing its median age hit 49 last year versus 38 for the U.S. Yet its labor force participation rate has actually been climbing over the past decade, and the last year it hit its highest level since 1999, the consequence of increasing female workplace participation. Maybe something similar could happen in the U.S., where the female labor force participation rate among women aged 25 to 54, the so-called prime age cohort, is now below Japan's. University of Michigan economist Betsy Stevenson points out that in the U.S., participation among prime age college-educated women was on an upswing prior to the pandemic. Perhaps that was the beginning of a new trend that could help improve overall participation in the years ahead. Meanwhile, the recent increase in wage growth for lower-paid workers relative to higher-paid ones might, over time, help draw more young men without college degrees into the workforce. The other thing that we have to talk about is prior to COVID, a big thing that we had been spending a good bit of time talking about was wage growth. I mean, we had even talked about in the years leading up to this the need to raise the minimum wage because wages weren't keeping pace with the cost of living. Well, not that COVID is a good thing by any means, but one of the possible positive things that came out of COVID is this drastic work cycle that took place forced wages higher, especially for the lowest paid individuals. Part of the reason maybe it never crossed previous generations' mind is because they had always seen that, yeah, even if you go work and you get this crap job, that you don't like you'll take the next step and you'll move on and you'll be able to get to a place that you want to be. However, if they look at it and say, yeah, well, that's not going to happen. I'm going to get this crap job and I'm just going to be at that crap job forever. I'm not sure they're analyzing the data, but they're seeing, well, here's this person who's 45 years old and they're still in this crap job. So I don't want to be 45 and be in that crap job. So I'm just not going to get that job. I'm not sure that there's a lot of technical analysis happening. I think it has more to do with the supposition of, I don't see people climbing out of these jobs, whether or not they are. I'm not seeing that take place. I don't have any hope of getting anything better than this job. So
but where's the adult? Where's the adult in their life showing them that this is the way it happens?
Good question.
And this is what you need to do. I mean, the whole point of, well, they're playing video. Well, how'd they get a phone? How'd they get the video game system if they're not working? And if somebody's just giving it to them, then isn't that the fault of the adults in their life who have just given them things and they just expect now as a young person to continue for society to just give them something? Where did this disconnect occur that you just get stuff without working for it?
You're also talking about different generations though, too. I mean, I think part of what becomes, tricky is that, yeah, that may not be true of millennials, but the youngest millennials are now 26 or 27 years old. So they're not even in that. Most of them are not even in that
so
college age entering the workforce range.
Come from my age group, we can't be blamed for these people.
It's not our fault.
Who aren't working.
It's the Gen Xers. That's whose fault it is, between millennials and boomers.
Okay.
Because they're the ones raising
and
the
we don't have one of those in here.
No,
so we can't.
They're the ones raising Gen Z. This is who we figured it out. This is who to blame.
There's our solution for today's show.
Gen X.
Gen X.
And not millennials or boomers.
Okay.
It's Gen X and Gen Z that are causing the problem. That's.
But you understand my point?
No,
it's some, and I see what you're saying, and you're being logical, and I'm being, irrational and screaming. But doggone it, I just really don't understand this whole concept of this whole thought process of, yes, I'm just never going to work in my life.
The other thing you asked though about was, where are the parents in these situations, right?
Or society. I won't even blame the parents. Where's society?
But parents specifically, because I think this is important. This is a metric that we've seen worsening in recent years. The most recent data from the Census Bureau, Lance, tells us that there are over 2 million children between the ages of 0 and 17 in the United States of America today who are not in the foster care
life, showing them that this is the way it happens.
Good question.
And this is what you need to do. I mean, the whole point of, well, they're playing video. Well, how'd they get a phone? How'd they get the video game system if they're not working? And if somebody's just giving it to them, then isn't that the fault of the adults in their life who have just given them things, and they just expect now as a young person to continue for society to just give them something? Where did this disconnect occur that you just get stuff without working for it?
You're also talking about different generations though, too. I mean, I think part of what becomes, tricky is that, yeah, that may not be true of millennials, but the youngest millennials are now 26 or 27 years old. So they're not even in that. Most of them are not even in that
so since
college
the
age
millennials
entering the workforce range.
Come from my age group, we can't be blamed for these people.
It's not our fault.
Who aren't working.
It's the Gen Xers. That's whose fault it is, between millennials and boomers.
Okay.
Because they're the ones raising
and
the
we don't have one of those in here.
No,
so we can't.
They're the ones raising Gen Z. This is who we figured it out. This is who to blame.
There's our solution for today's show.
Gen X.
Gen X.
And not millennials or boomers.
Okay.
It's Gen X and Gen Z that are causing the problem. But
you understand my point?
No,
it's some, and I see what you're saying, and you're being logical, and I'm being, irrational and screaming. But doggone it, I just really don't understand this whole concept of this whole thought process of, yes, I'm just never going to work in my life.
The other thing you asked though about was, where are the parents in these situations, right?
Or society. I won't even blame the parents. Where's society?
But parents specifically, because I think this is important. This is a metric that we've seen worsening in recent years. The most recent data from the Census Bureau, Lance, tells us that there are over 2 million children between the ages of 0 and 17 in the United States of America today who are not in the foster care system, right? That's not what they're in. Who are not living with even one parent. Okay? 2 million children in the United States right now, today, living with no parent. So that's grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle, friend. And by the way, that's also the officially reported number, because mind you, and you and I know this firsthand, how many students do we know of who, from a data standpoint, live with their parents, but don't live at their parents' house and do not see their parents on a day-to-day basis?
Yep.
Because
legally, their parents are still taking them off of their income tax, but they're not in the parents' home. The parents don't even necessarily live in the same city as their young person.
And they fill out the census and they say, well, how many dependents do you have? Well, I have this kid and this kid. Okay, but do those dependents live in the house with you? Do you actually take care of them? And my point that I'm getting at is, we say it's 2 million. Based on the numbers that aren't reported, it's probably super safe to say it's closer to 3 or 4. You might say, well, how big a deal is that? Well, that's about 5 to 6% of the current children in the United States, which is, by the way, a lot higher than historically it's been. So you ask, where are the parents? Well, there's a whole lot more children where the parents aren't there.
They're not involved in their lives.
Right. And that's not to say that mom or that aunt, uncle, grandma, grandpa, it's not to say they can't do a good job of raising, right? I'm not contending that. I'm saying, I just think that's another thing we have to throw in there when you talk about, well, how do you get to this point? Well, a lot of those kids are also, they don't live with the same person from 0 to 18 either. I think that's super important to point out too, because it's not so much that a person who raises them at some point doesn't do a good job, but if 5 different people raise them at 5 different segments of their life from 0 to 18,
how do you pick up these innate ideas of,
well, and
you
whose
have
values?
to work hard, and
because they're not all going to have the same values.
Sure, right.
And they're not going to have the same style. I mean, a lot of those things that you're not going to be able to ask an 18-year-old, why don't you want to go into the workforce, and then give you a cohesive answer. But if they grew up their whole life and there wasn't a consistent set of values being bestowed upon them, or the people in their life, because again, who are those children most likely being raised by? Probably people who aren't in the workforce. And that doesn't mean that grandma didn't work hard her whole life, but she done working. So you're growing up with a person who doesn't work.
So it's not being modeled for you.
So why would I mean, it looks to me like they got a pretty good life. Why would I go work? Well, you have to go work. Well, why?
And I've had that conversation with kids. They go, well, I'm just going to live with grandma. So what are you going to do when you get to be 40? Well, I'll live with grandma. And I've looked at them in the eye. And this is back when I was teaching. I said, grandma ain't going to be here when you're 40. And I had a couple students who started crying and saying, you told me my grandma's going to die. I said, by the time you're 40, odds are she probably is. And again, because they're so young, they didn't notice that. But your point is well taken. I mean, you got through to me. There's so many of them living with people who don't have to go to work, even though they've worked hard their whole life, that they just think they can continue to live that way. It's just, wow, though, but that's a real problem with our society, folks. And we need a way to fix that. Because to your point,
4% doesn't sound like a lot, but you're talking about millions of potential upcoming workers.
But you went from 67% down to 62%. There's your 4 to 5%. And to your point, and you say, well, how does this affect me? I don't care. I'm listening to this show. I'm fine. This doesn't involve me. My kids work hard, whatever. What you said, our economy will not continue to grow. Our economy is based on growth. If we don't fix this problem and get more people into the workforce, growth will stagnate, and then all of our lives the quality of life will drop down.
Well, not just growth, but our entitlement programs are totally based on a high enough participation rate to supplement the people who aren't working. Because remember, we don't have a system where the money you paid into Medicare and the money you paid into Social Security, you get back. You're paying for the people right now today who are using it. So if there's not enough people when you are getting to retirement, you don't get as much in the way of benefits.
That is correct.
It has a big impact, and it doesn't sound.
And that's why you should worry about this, right? This is why you should be concerned about this, is because we need to get, number one, we're short workers. Number two, we need to get more people into the workforce to pay for the entitlement programs that many people who are working are looking forward to obtaining when they reach the given age. And like you point out, it won't be there unless we get more people into the workforce immediately, post haste.
Yeah. The likelihood that a child living without either parent is in poverty is 38.1%. That's the likelihood that they live in poverty versus 7% if they're with 2 parents. Now, the other thing to know is that of those children who do not live with either parent, right, who don't live with a parent, over half of them live with a grandparent as of 2019. So again,